But a big thank you because now in Toronto it's 8 o'clock in the morning. So thank you, Jim, for sharing your time with us. And so, as you know, Jim Cummins is a professor emeritus in the University of Toronto, OISE, Canada, and of course well known for many theories about plurilingualism, identity text, and so on. So please, Jim, you can share your slideshow in English, and then you will have a discussion with Jean-Claude Beacco. Actually, Jean-Claude Beacco is in hospital for the moment. We are sorry about it. It's not serious. But I will, give the answer from Jean-Claude Beacco, myself. And we will have a small discussion after your presentation. So thank you again, Jim, and the floor is yours. You can share your slide.
Thank you, Nathalie, and my apologies to everybody that I'm not able to be there personally. I know it would be a better experience for all of us, but to be able to participate in this forum, which is obviously better than nothing. So I'm going to go right into my presentation. And the abstract that I sent to the organizers was quite long in terms of its title, but it attempted to express what I wanted to say in the presentation. So the title, the full title is Teaching and Learning in Multilingual Classrooms in Defense of the Pedagogical Relevance, Empirical Credibility, and Theoretical Legitimacy of so-called earlier theoretical concepts relating to plurilingualism, additive bilingualism, academic language, linguistic interdependence, and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. Now, obviously, there's enough here to keep all of us in session for the entire day. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and I'm not going to read everything that's on the slides, but you will have access to both the French and English PowerPoints later on. But the central issue that I want to address is to what extent is there validity to recent critiques of theoretical concepts, including the ones that you see there that I mentioned. I'll go through these critiques just very quickly to give you a sense of the connections between them, and then I'll go into more detail in relation to the specific ones. So in relation to plurilingualism, this concept has been attacked by a number of people, including Nelson Flores, Ophelia Garcia, and others, on the grounds that the concept of plurilingualism is simply a reflection of a neoliberal corporate agenda.
Sorry, Jim. Do you intend to share your slideshow now or later on?
Oh, I thought I was sharing. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
My apologies.
No, I thought it was maybe the introduction.
Sorry.
No, don't worry. I think you have all the rights to do that.
No, but I apologize. Okay, there we go. I thought I had shared the screen. Sorry.
No, don't worry.
Can you see it now?
Yes, very well. It's a presentation mode, please.
Okay, can you see the slides now?
Yes, but you should click on the presentation mode, I think, here. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Okay, let me just go back and just basically what I'll be talking about are issues that I tried to address in my book that came out a couple of years ago called Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners. And these are some of the issues that I want to talk about. But just to give it a quick overview of the issues, I've talked about the accusation that the concept of plurilingualism is simply a reflection of a neoliberal corporate agenda. In relation to issues concerning what we mean by language proficiency, there's been a strong focus by people involved in translanguaging theory, particularly the Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues, on rejecting the reality, the cognitive reality of languages. And so they use the term named languages to highlight the fact that languages have social reality, but have no cognitive or neurolinguistic reality. And because of that, notions of additive bilingualism and the concept of academic language, they argue, reflect racial-linguistic ideologies that frame racialized students as linguistically deficient. A different line of attack on the notion of academic language comes from Jeff McSwan, and Jeff, I know, will be participating in the conference, and he and I have gone back and forth on these issues over many years. But the argument from Jeff and Kelly Rolstad and some others is that schooling involves no language demands because language development is essentially complete by the time children arrive in school around age 5 and 6. Therefore, the notion of academic language, they argue, is inherently problematic. If we come to connections between languages, again, some of the concerns in relation to linguistic interdependence and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer come from Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues. And they argue that the related concepts of linguistic interdependence and the notion of a common underlying proficiency are rooted in static, monoglossic conceptions of bilingualism and multilingualism, rather than reflecting the dynamic, heteroglossic organization of multilingual cognitive and linguistic functioning. And they argue that, and this is a quote, because people do not speak languages, there's no legitimacy to the pedagogical practice of teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. So both the notion of linguistic interdependence and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer are rejected because essentially languages do not have any cognitive reality. So transferring across languages makes no sense. And then a different concern with the notion of linguistic interdependence comes from the work of Berthollet and Lambelet. And they argue that the concept of linguistic interdependence is not consistent with the empirical research findings. So I'm going to go into more detail on all of these arguments in the next 30 minutes or so. But one of the ways in which these notions or these arguments can be lumped together and contrasted is by contrasting what I've called, and Jeff McSwan has also used the term, unitary translanguaging theory that has been articulated by Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues, and comparing that with what I've called cross-linguistic translanguaging theory. And I'm using the acronyms UTT and CTT to refer to them. And so I'm just going to do these very quickly. The core argument proposed by Ophelia and her colleagues is that the bilingual's linguistic system is unitary and undifferentiated, and languages have no cognitive or linguistic reality. One of the things that they say, this is from an article written by Ricardo Ortega and colleagues, a language is not something that a person speaks. And then purely on the basis of this claim, unitary translanguaging theory rejects several influential theoretical concepts, including the notion of academic language, additive bilingualism or additive approaches to bilingualism, the notion of a common underlying proficiency that facilitates transfer across languages, and then pedagogically teaching for transfer across languages. And the claim put forward by unitary translanguaging theorists is that these concepts affirm the cognitive reality of languages, and thus they're monoglossic and static, rather than heteroglossic and dynamic in their underlying ideology. Now, in the book I mentioned, and in several articles, I've rejected these claims, and I put forward an alternative orientation to translanguaging theory, which claims that bilinguals actually do speak languages, and there's no need to insert the word named in front of languages, because languages actually do have reality within our cognitive and neurolinguistic systems. And these languages involve multiple registers and effective teaching promotes conceptual and linguistic transfer across languages. Cross-linguistic translanguaging theory proposes fluid social and cognitive boundaries between languages, Unitary translanguaging theory proposes no boundaries between languages because there's no languages. CTT affirms that the common underlying proficiency and teaching for cross-linguistic transfer are fully consistent with dynamic or heteroglossic orientations to bilingual cognitive processing, as are the concepts of additive bilingualism and academic language. Both orientations to translanguaging theory agree on the importance of pedagogical translanguaging, which I would define as instruction designed to enable students to use their entire multilingual or plurilingual repertoire in carrying out academic tasks and activities. So there's no pedagogical difference between these orientations, but there is certainly difference in the theoretical claims and assumptions underlying them. Now, the notion of early theoretical constructs, and which I've built into the title of this presentation, it came to me when I was reading the latest edition of Colin Baker and Wade Wright's classic textbook, Foundations of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. And they dismiss what they refer to as early theoretical constructs, consisting of notions of the difference between conversational and academic language as being oversimplified, problematic, ill-defined, and misleading. They're essentially repeating the critiques that have been made of that conception of academic language, but repeating them in an affirmative way. They obviously agree with them. They consistently repeat misrepresentations, such as describing the conceptual distinction between conversational and academic language as a dichotomy. There's a big difference between a dichotomy, which implies no connections between concepts, and a conceptual distinction, which is made for particular purposes in particular contexts and is a very different notion. I've virtually never used the term dichotomy. I've always talked about a conceptual distinction between conversational and academic language. And there's no consideration either of the multiple rebuttals of these misrepresentations, nor of empirical data relevant to the issues. So essentially what I'm arguing here is that an echo chamber is formed, where these concerns about the notion, the concept of academic language and other concepts are repeated over and over again, and there's never any attempt, or there hasn't been any attempt, to my knowledge, to seriously consider the arguments against this characterization of academic language. So in terms of looking at what are the criteria for evaluating the credibility of theoretical claims, in the book I put forward 3 criteria that we need to look at for evaluating the credibility and legitimacy of any theoretical construct. First of all, any theoretical claim needs to be consistent with all of the empirical evidence, all of the credible empirical evidence. Secondly, it needs to be logically coherent. If there are internal consistencies and contradictions within the arguments, then that casts doubt on the legitimacy of those arguments. And then I'm using the term consequential validity, which comes from the testing literature going back to the 1980s, put forward by Samuel Messick, to look at to what extent is the claim useful in promoting effective pedagogy and policies. So these 3 criteria for looking at the credibility of theoretical claims will come up as I look at these claims in more detail. So if we look at the arguments against plurilingualism, the argument that it's a reflection of neoliberal corporate agendas, Ophelia Garcia contrasted plurilingualism with translanguaging, and she argued that the construct of plurilingualism ignores power imbalances between speakers of different languages, and she says, in today's globalized neoliberal economy, plurilingualism is exalted as a tool for profit-making and personal gain. And similar arguments were made a number of years earlier by Nelson Flores. And by contrast, according to Ophelia and Ricardo Orthigue, translanguaging has a transformative potential to affirm students' dynamic multilingual realities by disrupting the concept of named languages and the power hierarchies in which languages are positioned. Now, I'm labeling these assertions because no empirical evidence is put forward to back up any of these assertions. And the claim that the concept of plurilingualism, as put forward by the Council of Europe quite a number of years ago, claimed that this concept ignores power relations and promotes a neoliberal political agenda is inconsistent with the fact that immigrant background and marginalized groups are explicitly included within the Council of Europe's advocacy of plurilingualism. David Little, among other authors, has made this very explicit. And if you look at the argument that plurilingualism promotes a neoliberal corporate agenda, well, this argument could be made without any educational qualification. So if somebody gets an engineering degree, are they a pawn of neoliberal corporate agendas because their expertise is going to contribute to corporate profit making? So the acquisition of any set of skills or abilities that could qualify as economic cultural capital would be subject to the same problematic claims of neoliberal complicity. So I see no merit to the arguments put forward that critique the notion of plurilingualism. If we look at the argument that named languages have no cognitive or neurolinguistic reality, as I said, this is a central concept underlying unitary translanguaging theory. And just to give you a sense of the kind of language that's used to make this claim, an article by Ophelia Garcia and colleagues back in 2021 made the point that our proposal advocates effacing the line of cognitive demarcation, purportedly separating the languages of the bilingual, a line that, born of abyssal thinking, is sustained by hegemonic sociocultural structures and ideologies, but not by psycholinguistic reality. By abyssal thinking, they mean essentially deficit-oriented thinking. And then another quote, in our view, the myriad lexical and structural features mastered by bilinguals occupy a cognitive terrain that's not fenced off into anything like the two areas suggested by the two socially named languages. The position, and this is the position that Jeff McSwan has put forward in his writing, and I put forward in relation to the common underlying proficiency, the position that while allowing for some overlap, the confidence of bilinguals involves language-specific internal differentiation, which we have called the dual correspondence theory, has had pernicious effects in educational practices. So, putting forward notions like additive bilingualism, talking about a legitimate distinction between conversational and academic language, the argument is that these notions have had pernicious effects in educational practices. Now, to what extent does the empirical data support this claim? Well, I'll just quote an observation by Bat and Bolognai in a couple of articles where they reviewed compelling data from studies of aphasia, demonstrating that the different languages of bilinguals have specific patterns of neural representation and organization. They cite the case of JZ, a Basque Spanish bilingual with aphasia, whose linguistic functioning in each language was affected in markedly different ways by his aphasia. I won't read the quote because it's essentially repeating what I've just said, but they make the claim that because there's differential loss of production in different languages of somebody experiencing aphasia, a unitary linguistic system cannot explain why one language is impacted more than another in differential bilingual aphasia. That argument is compelling in refuting the claim of unitary translanguaging theory, that languages have no psycholinguistic reality, no cognitive reality, no neurolinguistic reality, but it's totally consistent with the propositions underlying the common underlying cross-linguistic translanguaging theory. The third claim in relation to additive bilingualism. Unitary translanguaging theorists argue that additive bilingualism represents an illegitimate monolinguistic construct and what they called a retarding obstacle that has permeated the discourses of appropriateness fueled by racial linguistic ideologies. Now that's a mouthful, but it's basically a one-sentence summary of what the arguments are. Some of the assertions that are made, one by Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, discourses of appropriateness lie at the core of additive approaches to language education. Ophelia made the point that additive bilingualism involves the enforcement of named languages as wholes to be used separately, which stigmatizes even further minoritized speakers' more dynamic and fluid linguistic practices. Again, another quote, the bilingualism of Latinx bilingual students is not simply additive, it's dynamic. Standard language and additive bilingualism have been used as instruments to minoritize the language practices of some bilinguals and render them as deficient. And another claim put forward by Nelson Flores is that the notion of additive bilingualism does not address power relations involved in education. Now, there's no empirical evidence cited for any of these. And they totally distort the notion of the construct of additive bilingualism as it's been used for almost 50 years. The construct of additive bilingualism says nothing about how languages are processed cognitively by the individual. None of the many researchers who used the term over the past 40 years have made any claims regarding the cognitive or neurolinguistic organization of languages. The term is being used exclusively to argue against subtractive and racism-infused orientations to bilingualism. And the promotion of additive bilingualism over many years has played a major role in challenging coercive power relations. When used initially by Wallace Lambert in the mid-70s, it was used to argue that in the case of students from linguistic minority backgrounds that were being educated totally through the dominant school language, leading to subtractive forms of bilingualism where their first language did not develop and was often they were punished for using that language. We should be promoting an additive form of bilingualism that encourages students to continue developing their first language while they're adding the school language to that. So again, it has always been used in that sense. And again, from just a strictly linguistic point of view, if we look at the claim and the consistent opposition made by unitary translanguaging theorists between additive and dynamic, if you look at the antonyms of these terms, the antonym of additive is subtractive. The antonym of dynamic is static. There's no relationship, no semantic relationship whatsoever between additive and static. And yet, those are consistently conflated for rhetorical purposes. Moving on to claim number 4, academic language. The claim here is that the concept of academic language is a product of abyssal thinking and inherently and invariably racial-linguistic. Nelson Flores made the claim, academic language is a racial-linguistic ideology that frames racialized students as linguistically deficient and in need of remediation. Another quote, we argue that racial-linguistic ideologies undergird the notion that racialized bilinguals lack a construct known in schools as academic language. Efforts to purportedly teach racialized students to use academic language are fundamentally flawed. These efforts emerge from abyssal thinking. Now, there's been also a tsunami of articles repeating these kinds of claims. And as I said, they have all of the characteristics of an echo chamber because they never look at empirical issues related to academic language. They never look at multiple rebuttals that I and other people have made to some of these claims. But the characterization of academic language as racial-linguistic, in other words, that's another term for racist, essentially, is made unequivocally with no qualifications and no reference to any empirical data. There's a massive amount of empirical research supporting the conceptual distinction between conversational and academic language. And the work of Paula Uccelli and Stelling and colleagues illustrates that. And there's a glaring internal logical contradiction between the characterization of academic language as racist and the simultaneous claim by UTT theorists that schools must teach standard academic language to all students. If its academic language is racist, if it's a racial linguistic ideology, why would you teach it? Here's a quote from Ophelia from her book published in 2009. She says, because literacy relies on the standard language itself is taught explicitly in school, and it certainly needs to be taught. We are not questioning the teaching of a standard language in school. Without its acquisition, language minority children will continue to fail and will not have equal access to resources and opportunities. And the whole argument, like that's totally contradicting what they're saying in the left-hand column. But the whole argument, the unqualified argument that academic language is racist, it leads to all kinds of pedagogical questions. For example, are teachers who provide conceptual feedback and linguistic feedback on students' writing, are they complicit with racial linguistic ideologies and discourses of appropriateness because they're trying to help students develop stronger writing skills? You know, the questions keep on going, but there's never any attempt to address these rebuttals or counter-arguments. Claim number 5 involves some of the work that Jeff McSwan and Kelly Ralsted and others have made. Their essential argument, and this is coming from a Chomskyan perspective, is that schooling plays little role in developing language proficiency in the context of native language ability. Basically what they're saying is that by the time students arrive in school at age 5 or 6, they've essentially acquired, and in a quote from Kelly Ralsted, they've already learned most of the rules of their home language and possess an essentially adult-like grammar. Children's biological endowment for language underlies these special linguistic achievements and suggests that all children should be linguistically successful regardless of their social status. In other words, the concept of academic language proficiency and the fact that there are clearly individual differences between children in literacy and academic language components generally, for example, vocabulary knowledge, that is essentially claiming that some children are linguistically deficient. Because we're talking about language proficiency, and we're saying there are individual differences there, so children down at the bottom of that distribution are being characterized as linguistically deficient. On the right-hand column, you've got an attempt to show these arguments in a visual form, where within particular sociocultural contexts, the argument put forward by Jeff McSwan and others is that there's no relationship, minimal relationship between language proficiency and either literacy and other forms of school achievement and cognitive functioning. The argument that I put forward is that there's a strong relationship among all three of these in the context of schooling. And academic performance involves a fusion of aspects of language proficiency, aspects of literacy, and aspects of cognitive functioning. So if we look at the arguments against that claim. So first of all, the logic of defining language knowledge of independent of and unrelated to literacy and academic achievement leads to some bizarre conclusions and is contrary to the beliefs of virtually all researchers who do not subscribe to an extreme Chomskyan theoretical perspective. So for example, the area of language arts is commonly used in curriculum documents in North America and elsewhere to talk about teaching of literacy in one's native language and expanding children's ability to use a wider variety of registers in their language. That becomes a meaningful term within this concept. And a focus on developing language awareness or even critical language awareness across the curriculum becomes meaningless because language has no relationship to anything that happens in school after age 5 or 6. So this position also implies that any literacy-related knowledge, such as range and depth of vocabulary, ability to understand and use formal discourse patterns, as well as reading and writing expertise generally, have minimal relationships to language proficiency. Now, despite the uncritical acceptance of this position in the Baker and Wright textbook and in other documents, it's rejected by virtually all other educational linguists. Just a couple of quotes. Chris Baltus and Sarah Huddleston, who have been quite critical of the notion of cognitive academic language proficiency, they totally reject this. You acknowledge that they're rejecting it. They say language and literacy cannot be separated. Put another way, both spoken language and written language are language. They are different sides of the same coin. George Bunch, language has long been understood to play a central role, perhaps the central role in teaching and learning. And in a European Union Commission report, put out a couple of years ago, they make the point that the language of schooling is a highly complex and foundational skill for learning. Every teacher is a language teacher. Okay, so again, to argue that language is independent of and has virtually no role in developing literacy and overall academic achievement leads to, as I said, some bizarre conclusions. Okay, claim number 6, the notion of a common underlying proficiency and the pedagogical practice of teaching through cross-linguistic transfer are rooted in static monoglossic conceptions of bilingualism and multilingualism, and reflect the dynamic, rather than reflecting the dynamic heteroglossic organization of multilingual cognitive and linguistic functioning. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into much detail about this, but you can see on the right the visual representation that I've used of the notion of common underlying proficiency, where even though surface features of languages can clearly be distinguished, there's a common underlying proficiency underlying that. And so Garcia and colleagues reject the notion of transfer. They say that we can now shed the concept of transfer in favor of conceptualization of integration of language practices in the person of the learner. And they argue that the notion of cross-linguistic transfer has proven harmful to the education of racialized bilinguals. There's a really nice visual metaphor put forward by Sophie Tamanti in New Zealand. And she uses the metaphor of the Kaikitea tree, which grows in waterlogged, swampy soil, and is characterized by a network of entangled roots that bind multiple trees together, thereby enhancing the strength of each individual tree. She likens multilingualism to that. Whereas we can distinguish, we can see the individual trees, but underneath that, there's a network, a dynamic network of interlocking roots. And she makes the point that multilingualism or plurilingualism is very similar to that. And I think that's a really clear illustration of the fact that languages exist. We can see the trees, but they're strongly interconnected at a deeper level. Okay, if we look at the notion of a common underlying proficiency, there's an incredibly strong empirical support basis for that. If we look at the study review of literature called Promoting the Educational Success of Children and Youth Learning English, that about 30 academics from North America were involved in, including Jethro Swan. They make the point that the languages of bilinguals are highly interactive. The two languages share a cognitive conceptual foundation. And they go on, and I won't go into detail there. The last point I want to make concerns the work of Raphael Berthollet and Julia Lambelet. And they carried out a very impressive study involving Portuguese first language students in both French and German-speaking regions of Switzerland. And they looked at their progress from beginning grade 3 to the end of grade 4 in both their languages. And they set out to test the interdependence hypothesis. They argued that their findings do not support linguistic interdependence. But when you look at their data, it's a totally different story. You can see the correlations there from time 1 to time 2, time 2 to time 3. P/P is interlinguistic correlations between Portuguese proficiency tested at time 1 and time 2 and time 2 and time 3. And then P/F is Portuguese and French correlations, and P/G is Portuguese and German in the German region. you can see that there are very strong intra-language correlations between Portuguese proficiency at different times. But there are very strong correlations also, not quite as strong obviously, that are cross-linguistic between Portuguese and French, Portuguese and German. If we look at the correlations between time 2 and time 3, there's basically just a 10-point difference between the intra-language correlation and the cross-linguistic correlation. In the French region, the correlation between Portuguese and French is 0.58, highly significant, compared to 0.69 for intra-language Portuguese correlations. So the data are totally consistent with the notion of linguistic interdependence. Okay, to wrap up, so there's a solid empirical and conceptual basis to support the following conclusions with respect to the legitimacy of what have pejoratively been called earlier theoretical concepts. Plurilingualism is a coherent and legitimate theoretical construct that reflects does not reflect the argument that lingualism is a coherent and legitimate theoretical construct, and there's no evidence that it reflects the neoliberal corporate agenda, and that's asserted with no empirical or logical credibility. Claims that concepts such as additive bilingualism, academic language, and common underlying proficiency are monoglossic and consequently have exerted harmful and pernicious effects on the education of minoritized students have simply been asserted without any empirical or logical evidence. The claim that language development is essentially complete by age 5 and 6 and therefore unrelated to literacy or academic attainment is rejected by the vast majority of researchers. There's extensive empirical support for the concept of cross-linguistic interdependence and for the instructional benefits of teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. In short, many of the claims associated with unitary translanguaging theory derive from the assertion that people don't speak languages. And these claims, I'm arguing, are empirically unsupported, they're logically flawed, and they're unhelpful pedagogically. By contrast, the claims of cross-linguistic translanguaging theory, I would argue, are supported by the research evidence, they're logically coherent, and they carry direct implications for classroom instruction and school-based language policies. So thank you.
Many thanks, Jim, for your conference. Donc, merci beaucoup à Jim Cummins. Donc, avant de passer la parole à la salle, je vais apporter la réponse de Jean-Claude Beacco et aussi quelques commentaires personnels. Je vais Jim, I will speak in French, but my slideshow is in English. So, sorry, just a minute. I will share it with you right now. I hope you will be able to have a look at it. Can you see it, Jim? Can you see the slideshow, Jim?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Donc je vais commencer, je vais faire une réponse donc sous couvert de Jean-Claude Beacco à Jim. Donc déjà merci beaucoup à Jim pour cette discussion. On est vraiment au cœur du débat scientifique. Je trouve que c'est bien, c'est le deuxième jour. On a vu les présentations effectivement de Li Wei hier, de Yezone et Senos sur ces questions. Donc là on est vraiment sur un débat scientifique avec des affirmations et des réfutations. Donc pour nous c'est très éclairant. Donc merci beaucoup Jim pour ces apports. Et puis aussi une mise en abîme historique finalement de ces notions. Et je pense qu'on a aussi beaucoup de jeunes doctorants dans la salle. Il y a ce besoin de se replonger sur l'histoire épistémologique de ces concepts.
Alors effectivement, ce qui est très intéressant dans ta présentation, c'est que Jim, à la fois tu parles de la question de l'apprentissage et de l'enseignement. Donc tu essayes de traiter des deux de façon, Jean-Claude Beacco et moi on dirait holistique, hein, donc de le prendre de pair. Et puis tu as un spectre très très large, et c'est sur ces questions que Jean-Claude avait envie de réagir, la question de multilingual classrooms. Parce que derrière les classes multilingues, on peut avoir vraiment des publics et des dispositifs qui sont très différents. Donc à voir comment effectivement on peut, dans le détail, mettre en place ces notions du point de vue à la fois de l'apprentissage et de l'enseignement. Donc un petit hommage à Jean-Claude Beacco. Donc pour ceux qui ne le connaissent pas, hein, professeur émérite à Sorbonne Nouvelle, et une de ses publications peut-être qui résonne le plus avec ce qu'a proposé aujourd'hui comme conférence Jim Cummins, le guide pour le développement et la mise en œuvre des curriculums hein, pour une éducation plurilingue et interculturelle. Donc tout son travail au Conseil de l'Europe résonne énormément avec le travail de Jim. Alors, au niveau des débats hein, et au niveau des centres d'intérêt, effectivement, on a bien vu hein, depuis hier aussi qu'on a une controverse finalement entre une perspective qu'on va appeler plus classique peut-être en Europe, hein, des approches plurilingues ou de la définition que Daniel aussi a pu donner de la compétence plurilingue et pluriculturelle, et puis des propositions plus autour de translanguaging, mais d'une certaine perspective de translanguaging, parce que on a également vu hein, depuis ces 2 derniers jours que, par exemple, quand le dernier numéro de l'IDI est sorti sur les pratiques translangagières, on n'est pas vraiment sûr qu'on soit vraiment sur une perspective UTT. Hein. Donc voilà, comment finalement les notions naviguent des 2 côtés des continents et d'une langue à l'autre aussi, et sont parfois réinterprétées par les chercheurs ou dans les projets scientifiques qu'ils peuvent mener. Donc finalement, pour Jean-Claude, hein, je reprends aussi les propos de Jean-Claude, c'est qu'effectivement, là où on peut somme toute s'accorder, c'est qu'il y a une demande sociale qui est très importante hein, autour du plurilinguisme, des publics multilingues, de l'enseignement des langues, avec vraiment une volonté forte de justice sociale. Ça, je pense que tous les chercheurs partagent cette préoccupation, mais finalement, on voit qu'au niveau des notions, il y a une appréhension qui peut être différente et une conceptualisation qui peut être différente. Notamment, on l'a vu hein, autour des questions de name languages, donc est-ce que les langues ont un nom, est-ce que les langues ont une frontière, etc. Et donc, voilà, ça c'est vraiment très intéressant de le noter, d'autant plus, ça on l'a un peu évoqué aussi hier, c'est que dans nos dispositifs, alors là on peut parler par exemple de la France, souvent les langues sont enseignées de façon coupée. Là il y a une réelle frontière entre le fait qu'on enseigne une langue et puis est-ce qu'on prend en compte vraiment les répertoires plurilingues des élèves. Alors l'idée c'est de débattre, et évidemment quand on est dans un débat scientifique, la volonté, ce serait de convaincre. Donc là, on le voit aussi, Jim, dans ta proposition. Alors, est-ce qu'on pourrait arriver à un consensus entre les approches, et est-ce que c'est le consensus qu'il faut viser? Alors, vous avez vu que moi, pour ma part, hein, modestement, je suis davantage dans un paradigme de la complexité. Comment on peut essayer, au contraire, de faire des liens entre toutes ces approches? On n'est pas obligé d'être d'accord, mais plutôt l'idée, ce serait d'être dans une discussion. Et finalement, Jim, ce que disait Jean-Claude en te lisant, c'est que tu es assez proche, enfin plus proche, on va dire, des conceptions qui ont pu être développées en Europe autour de la notion de plurilinguisme et puis de la compétence plurilingue et pluriculturelle. Alors, il y a des attaques hein, concernant une politique néolibérale liée à ces concepts qu'on a pu voir aussi de façon sporadique en France autour du CECR. Ça peut arriver, quelques chercheurs isolés, mais enfin c'est quelque chose aussi qui peut émerger. Alors là, je me distance un peu de Jean-Claude, là c'est ma parole personnelle, mais ce que je pourrais dire, c'est que effectivement, quel est l'agenda de nos institutions? Ça, bien malin qui pourrait le dire. Donc effectivement, en Europe, on est dans une situation multilingue. Alors, les institutions font la promotion du multilinguisme, mais quel multilinguisme? Donc ça aussi, ce sera peut-être une question à poser à nos institutions demain, à la table ronde, parce que prendre en compte, par exemple, les langues familiales, ou comme on pourrait appeler en Amérique du Nord, les langues d'héritage des élèves, on voit qu'il y a encore une marche quand même peut-être au niveau des institutions à cette prise en compte de ces langues. Donc ce sera des questions à poser. Et puis, ce que disait Jean-Claude à la lecture de ta proposition, Jim, c'est qu'effectivement, est-ce que là, on n'est pas vraiment sur des questionnements politiques, peut-être plus que réellement didactiques à un moment donné. Voilà. Alors, on aura une conférence avec Jean-Louis Schiss sur les idéologies, et je pense que Jean-Louis, tu pourras nous parler aussi de ces questions. Alors, Jean-Claude Beacco avait de nombreuses remarques, donc se déportant d'un débat qui serait plus politique. Il avait de nombreuses remarques aussi sur qu'est-ce qu'on entend finalement par multilingual class ou classes, parce que pour lui, et ça je le suis tout à fait, c'est un terme qui représente, enfin qui embrasse des réalités qui peuvent être très très différentes. Donc évidemment, on pense aux élèves qui viennent d'arriver, alors en France ou ailleurs, hein, donc voilà, ça peut être undocumented kids, hein, par exemple en Amérique du Nord, et on voit bien qu'effectivement, il y a eu un travail quand même d'identification des chercheurs qui font des travaux sur ces problématiques, donc on en a de nombreux, hein. On a Véronique Piguet-Ladissou qui est venue, Catherine Mendoza-Diaz, donc voilà, des gens, moi-même j'ai beaucoup travaillé aussi sur ces publics, donc voilà, ça c'est des recherches qui sont assez identifiées sur la question évidemment de l'inclusion et sur le fait aussi d'utiliser les langues des élèves et ce répertoire présent, et puis voilà, de considérer que peut-être que dans les classes, finalement, où on accueille ces élèves, on est peut-être plus sensible à ces répertoires, mais quand on arrive dans un autre dispositif, ce que reconnaissait, enfin, ce qu'a pu exprimer Jean-Claude, donc ce qu'on appelle la classe ordinaire, là, qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec les répertoires de ces élèves? Et là, on a l'impression qu'il y a quand même plus de difficultés. Donc là, j'apporte des éléments, hein, des travaux qu'on a pu mener ici à Montpellier, notamment avec la communauté gitane, donc qui parle le catalan septentrional, et de cette difficulté à se saisir du catalan septentrional, qui en plus est une langue régionale minorisée, hein, par rapport au catalan central de Barcelone. Et donc les enseignants ont du mal à utiliser cette forme, qui en plus est une forme essentiellement orale, comme un élément du répertoire intéressant finalement pour travailler. Alors dans nos recherches, on avait vu que pour les dictées, par exemple, quand on repassait par le catalan septentrional, les lettres muettes, les accords, etc. s'entendaient, et que finalement les élèves avaient presque de meilleurs résultats qu'un élève francophone qui ne pourrait pas passer par le truchement d'une langue romane où on peut entendre finalement. Donc vous voyez, il y a des avantages qui ne sont pas forcément perçus en classe ordinaire. Donc on voit bien que selon finalement les classes multilingues, on n'a pas forcément les mêmes objectifs et on n'a pas forcément le même public, ça c'est ce que remarquait aussi Jean-Claude, et que, alors moi j'ai appelé ça le recyclage des langues, hein, parce qu'on est un peu dans des métaphores de l'écologie actuellement, c'est-à-dire que plutôt que de dire ces répertoires de ces élèves qui parlent le catalan septentrional, des langues régionales ou des mix, etc., il faudrait les mettre sous le tapis à la déchetterie, j'ai envie de dire. Non, l'idée ce serait plutôt au contraire de les recycler, hein, dans un cycle vertueux, ou au contraire, ça c'est ce que tu dis aussi Jim, c'est que les interférences avec ton modèle de l'iceberg, eh bien, deviennent une possibilité de réflexion méta. Alors là je pense au nouveau livre, hein, Claudine Garcia-Deban, que tu as mis en œuvre sur le fait de pouvoir comparer avec d'autres langues des questions de grammaire de façon assez systématique dans des ouvrages. Donc ça c'est nouveau, hein, on n'a pas encore ça dans la littérature des éditeurs. Et donc, ce qu'on peut voir aussi dans les travaux de recherche, c'est que quand on prend l'habitude de travailler de cette manière-là avec les élèves, qu'on appelle ça approche plurilingue ou translanguaging, on s'aperçoit que les élèves eux-mêmes se rendent compte qu'il y a des inférences intéressantes à faire, il y a des liens à créer. Donc voilà, on crée des opportunités en fait de mettre en relief les liens. Alors, dans les classes ordinaires, hein, ce que soulignait Jean-Claude, c'est que, et on l'a vu aussi dans certains symposiums concernant l'enseignement des mathématiques ou d'autres disciplines, ce qu'ont pu expliquer aussi ce matin Laurent Gaillot ou Fred Genesi, hein, c'est qu'effectivement, quels sont les outils qu'on pourrait mettre en œuvre autour de ces répertoires plurilingues quand on enseigne une discipline. Alors, Marissa, qui travaille pour le CELV, hein, sur différents programmes. Il y a eu différents programmes, effectivement, j'en cite quelques-uns, Combat Plus, ou Maladive, Majority, Language and Diversity in the Classroom. Katia Schnitzer, qui a participé aussi à ce projet qui est dans la salle, peut en témoigner. On a essayé de mettre en place des outils de formation pour les enseignants, justement, pour essayer d'inciter à utiliser ce répertoire, vous voyez finalement dans des dispositifs où c'est pas attendu. Évidemment, quand on est en France, on appelle ça UPE2A, c'est des classes pour recevoir les élèves allophones. Mais dans les autres dispositifs, qu'est-ce qu'on peut mettre en place? Alors le problème, c'est que les enseignants ont du mal à s'identifier comme étant des enseignants enseignant la langue majoritaire de scolarisation. C'est le nom, par exemple, des projets. Am I a majority language teacher? Donc ça, je ne suis pas sûre que les enseignants se reconnaissent et vont vers ces ressources finalement. Donc ça, c'est aussi des questions qu'on se pose sur les langues des disciplines, sur le fait, et ça Jim, tu l'as dit aussi, est-ce que les enseignants, quelle que soit la discipline qu'ils enseignent, se reconnaissent avant tout comme un enseignant ayant des pratiques langagières spécifiques de leur discipline? Donc ça, c'est probablement en formation initiale aussi quelque chose qui est très important. Alors Jim, je parle aussi du projet auquel tu as participé et qui a pu concerner des classes ordinaires. Le projet Binogi Escape, mené donc par toi Jim, aussi Emmanuel Le Pichon-Borgsman, et puis nous-mêmes ici à l'Humain à Montpellier, où on a pu utiliser des animés scientifiques où les élèves peuvent choisir les langues dans lesquelles ils travaillent sur une notion théorique. Donc vous voyez, ça peut être les atomes, le théorème de Pythagore. Ils peuvent choisir des animés où les personnages parlent une langue et c'est sous-titré dans une autre langue. Et les quiz aussi sont dans certaines langues. Donc vous voyez, c'est aussi une façon de pouvoir continuer les apprentissages disciplinaires sans forcément attendre d'être assez compétent dans la langue. Donc c'était vraiment un projet intéressant. Donc merci Jim, grâce à toi, on a pu participer aussi à le mettre en place. Alors ce qui était intéressant, c'est que ça peut être mis en place pour des élèves allophones, pour des élèves francophones qui, eux, auraient bien aimé faire du CLIL, mais le CLIL, c'est limité au niveau du nombre d'inscrits dans les collèges et dans les lycées. Donc ils ont pu faire du CLIL grâce à ça. Donc moi, je trouve que c'est vraiment intéressant, et peut-être là, par les pratiques, on est en train de transcender aussi les débats qu'on a, pour proposer des ressources dont les enseignants peuvent s'emparer et dont les élèves peuvent profiter. Alors ça aussi, c'est une collection qu'on vient de mettre en place avec un éditeur. Donc je pense aussi que la question de l'édition, j'ai cité ton livre, Claudine Garcia-Deban, c'est important aussi que les éditeurs s'emparent du plurilinguisme. Il y a quelques manuels, par exemple Fleur d'encre aussi, qui proposent des comparaisons avec des langues. Donc là, c'est une collection pour les élèves allophones. Mais les enseignants, tout de suite, quand la collection est parue, ont commencé à me dire « Mais est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas l'utiliser pour des élèves francophones ou de deuxième ou troisième génération qui ont des difficultés avec la langue de scolarisation et qui seraient très intéressés par faire des sciences ou des mathématiques avec un soutien et une explication des pratiques langagières qui sont attendues dans ces disciplines. Et évidemment, en ayant recours au répertoire plurilingue, parce que dans chaque cahier, on propose à toutes les séquences un répertoire plurilingue où les élèves peuvent noter dans d'autres langues, schématiser, etc. Ça, c'est aussi parfois difficile à faire comprendre à des éditeurs, mais c'était vraiment des éléments auxquels on tenait pour travailler. Donc tu vois, vraiment, Jim, c'était des réflexions qui venaient à Jean-Claude et effectivement, ensuite, à sa suite, ça a résonné avec des projets qu'on peut mener. Alors, évidemment, Jean-Claude a aussi parlé de qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire en langue vivante. Souvent, en langue vivante, on ne pense pas forcément au répertoire aussi des élèves, donc c'est pourtant un endroit très favorable. Alors, on a tous les travaux sur l'intercompréhension des langues vivantes avec Claire Blanche-Benveniste et puis Pierre Escudé actuellement, qui sont très importants pour nous, mais finalement peu utilisés, je trouve trop peu utilisés dans les classes. Et puis, Li Wei en a parlé, les étudiants qui peuvent devenir des enseignants, finalement des co-experts, des co-teachers. Et je voulais dire que dans les pratiques menées, on a énormément d'enfants qui arrivent, par exemple, du Maroc, qui sont passés en Espagne, qui ont une très bonne compétence en catalan ou en castillan et qui pourraient être des assistants des professeurs de langue. Mais ça, c'est pas du tout valorisé, malheureusement. Là, vous voyez un élève qui fait une présentation multilingue dans un musée et qui explique, comme on dit, tableau en mandarin, qui montre d'autres. Donc voilà, vraiment, on arrive à des objectifs de la culture éducative savante, etc., au travers aussi de ces répertoires. Donc c'est intéressant de les mobiliser. Et je voudrais finir avec un projet que Yeson Senose a copiloté dans son université. Montpellier aussi a participé avec les collègues de Finlande qui étaient pilotes sur le projet Linguistically Sensitive Teaching in All Classrooms, que tu connais aussi, Jim, puisque tu es allé aussi évaluer ce projet en Finlande. Et l'idée, alors est-ce qu'on peut aussi trouver d'autres termes où on a peut-être davantage de consensus, où on reparle peut-être davantage des projets? Autour de nous, on avait choisi sensitive. Hein, donc c'était pas translanguaging qu'on a pu utiliser aussi pour d'autres projets ou plurilinguisme qu'on a pu utiliser pour d'autres projets, mais là sur ce projet il y avait peut-être Yesson et tu pourras réagir, l'idée d'utiliser le terme de sensibilité, sensitive aussi parce que c'était avec les 5 sens, donc comment on peut avoir une pratique aussi, alors Liwei a aussi parlé des pratiques artistiques etc. et aussi dans d'autres ateliers, donc c'est une proposition mais bien sûr rien n'est fermé, hein. Ce sont des discussions à avoir. Donc merci beaucoup, Jim. Et maintenant, on va écouter les questions de la salle. Merci encore. So Jim, I will give the floor to the audience now. So I will be up with my mic. Oh, okay, it's not. Okay. Non, c'est pas bon. Voilà. Merci. Alors, des questions. Qui veut poser des questions à Jim? Ah oui, merci Sylvain de briser la glace. Break the ice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, Professor Cummins. Can you hear me? Yeah?
I hear you, yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Sylvain de Terme from Waseda University, Tokyo, Japan. And so I'm a minority language speaker because I'm speaking in English, but I'm French. And you know it's kind of difficult to be speaking in French in such context. Anyway, I think it was very interesting and impressive the way you tackle these contemporary issues. Now I have 2 questions. First of all, if my understanding is correct, you're in Canada right now, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, and so you know we are in France and we are having this international conference both in English and in French. And you know, we listen to terms such as racial linguistics and so on, and these terms are phrased in English. And as French readers and French speakers, we decipher them with our own, linguistic abilities and understanding of what they refer to. Now, this is what I call, the danger of the vehicular and the linguistic transparency. As you know, in French, I'm just taking a very sensitive concept here, the one of race in English, which is Race in French or Rasse in German. And my German colleague is always a bit, finding himself in a clumsy situation when he's trying to publish in the States and he's being asked his race. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are some concepts and notions which are passed on through such conferences and papers coming from North America, but actually without explicitly stating and explaining the historical, sociological, and political situation of the States. And in France, things are different. So I think, first of all, I think it's important to understand that despite the prevalence of the academic debate in the States, there are different stories, contexts, sociolinguistic situations, and histories which must be taken into account, particularly for the younger ones who are not fully aware of this. That's point number 1. The point number 2, regarding these debates, don't you feel that, on the one hand, we need to answer these claims, but at the same time, looking at it from the point of view of linguistics and the sciences of language, somehow aren't we spending too much time and are we giving them too much echo? Because when we look at them from the perspective of the language of science, we feel that some people clearly are lacking in scientific foundational education and knowledge of proper linguistics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for those comments and questions. In relation to your first point, clearly terminology and issues, concepts don't always travel in the same way across different cultural and linguistic and national contexts. So I think I agree totally that terms need to be excavated a little bit to show what they're addressing. And the notion of racial linguistic ideologies put forward by Nelson Flores is not a new concept. The term is new, but we've known for many generations that racism is embedded in language policies. When children are, for example, Mexican-American children in the United States or Roma children in Europe and indigenous children around the world, when they are punished for speaking their home languages in school, that is racism being enacted through linguistic policies and linguistic actions. But the terms, when they cross cultural and national boundaries, need to be explicated more than probably they have been. And in relation to your second point, I totally agree that there is a lack of, shall we say, scientific rigor in many of the arguments related to notions like academic language, translanguaging, etc. One consistent process that seems to happen is that notions like additive bilingualism, academic language, are made scapegoats for educational malpractice. So because we know that in many countries around the world, historically and currently, children from minoritized or racialized backgrounds have been subject to various kinds of discrimination within schools. And this would include the deaf community in many countries. We take that reality and then we find a concept that, such as academic language, that then becomes a scapegoat for that. And so when Nelson Flores says academic language is a racial-linguistic ideology, no qualifications, no equivocation, no contextualization of this. I don't know what he means by that. How can an academic concept and the reality of the language of schooling be a racial-linguistic concept? Obviously, the way academic language may be been taught in schools, the didactics of it, the way there's been exclusion of the languages of minority communities within schools, all of those practices can be seen as discriminatory or racist, depending on which term you want to use in particular context. But to say that academic language is the cause of that is sort of equivalent to taking the concept of democracy. And just because there are all kinds of problems and discriminatory processes involved in the operation of democracy. For example, in the United States, there's been systematic exclusion of particular groups, attempt to stop particular groups voting historically and currently. So there's all kinds of problems in the operation of democracy in countries around the world. But does that mean that the concept of democracy is inherently flawed? Obviously not. But that's the same logic that is used in relation to scapegoating notions like academic language and additive bilingualism. And so the point that was made earlier on by Nathalie, that we have political issues intertwined with linguistic and scientific issues, and sometimes what gets expressed is a political viewpoint that becomes unhinged from the research. And so what I've tried to argue is that if we're going to rigorously evaluate the legitimacy or credibility of any theoretical concept, we need to look at the empirical evidence, not just dismiss it. And the empirical evidence in relation to academic language has been totally ignored by critics. And there's been an echo chamber created. I pointed out in my presentation a number of logical contradictions that are not addressed. And then the consequential validity of arguing, for example, that language is independent of academic achievement, language is independent of didactics in school, essentially, in literacy. What does that say to all of the teachers who are trying to integrate language and content, trying to build up language awareness amongst their students? And so we need to address the arguments against that. And I don't think that has happened. And so, I agree with the fact that from a scientific point of view, from the point of view of scientific inquiry, we need to get out of our echo chambers and engage in a serious way with the arguments that have been made on both sides of the issue.
Merci beaucoup, Jim. Une dernière question peut-être aux remarques avant de se quitter. Oui, Daniel Coste. Alors, je vais tourner, comme ça tu verras Daniel.
I find this session quite exciting indeed. Je me demandais si ça n'a pas des échos d'un débat beaucoup plus ancien et à certains égards plus distant quant aux opposants, du temps disons, des discussions entre Basil Bernstein et William Labov, avec d'un côté une position, disons, de sociologue de l'éducation très située sur les questions de curriculum en particulier, et de l'autre côté avec Labov, quelqu'un qui a été véritablement du côté d'une sociolinguistique pure et dure, si je peux dire, extrême. Et j'ai l'impression que dans ce que vous faites actuellement, disons, de part et d'autre, c'est beaucoup plus du close combat. Hein. On est sur le même ring, en quelque sorte. Hein. Alors qu'à l'époque, il y avait une certaine distance, mais peut-être qu'on est là sur des questions qui sont encore plus centrales dans la façon dont vous les abordez les uns et les autres, même si mon cœur penche d'un côté plus que l'autre.
Okay. And thank you for those comments. Clearly, when we look at what's happening in the academy, and when we look at, for example, the debates about something like the restricted and elaborated codes that Bernstein was getting at, the terminology that we use can be inflammatory. And I think Bernstein's intentions with making that distinction were valid. What he was basically trying to get at is the fact that children from low-income backgrounds and children who are growing up pretty often do not have the same opportunities to have literate experiences in the home. They find that their development of pre-literacy skills may be less than those who are coming from more privileged backgrounds. And so I think that was what he was getting at in that distinction. But that easily gets translated into a deficit perspective, where what he's saying is that children from low-income backgrounds are linguistically deprived. I don't think that was what he was trying to get at all. But when you make a point based on the empirical data, for example, that there are differences in the, for example, the literacy exposure, the literacy socialization that cut across class barriers, such that children from working class backgrounds may have less exposure to some of the pre-literacy skills that children from middle class backgrounds have got from being read to on a constant basis over 4 or 5 years. If you point out that those differences exist, then it's very easy for somebody to say, well, you're saying that linguistic children from low-income backgrounds are linguistically deprived. We're talking not about deprivation, we're talking about opportunity gaps that schools have got to address. And so the schools need to pick up on the funds of knowledge, they need to pick up on the varieties of language, they need to pick up on all of the experiences that children bring into school and build on them. But it's very hard to not to have one's work distorted in the current atmosphere. And I think I've experienced that in terms of some of the reactions to my work, and it's happened elsewhere, obviously also.
Merci beaucoup, Jim. Merci beaucoup pour tes commentaires. Thank you, Jim. Very nice to be with you today. Donc, merci beaucoup. Alors, avant de quitter la salle, j'aimerais vous dire quelques mots. Donc, see you, Jim. I will end the conversation. So, thanks again.
Okay.
And see you soon.
Everybody.
Bye-bye. Many thanks. Alors, avant peut-être de se quitter, j'avais quelques remarques à vous faire pour ce soir. Donc, pour ceux qui sont au repas de gala, départ à 6h30 par le bus qui nous emmènera au bord de la Méditerranée pour un repas. Et puis retour aussi à Saint-Charles. Voilà. Alors n'oubliez pas d'aller voir Marissa Cavalli si vous avez envie de discuter des projets du programme du CELP, du Conseil de l'Europe, à la pause, pendant le café qui aura lieu ici.